you very much, Sarah, and your organizing team for organizing this event. I think you and everyone attending, you forgive me for not, preparing slides, but it's good to see everyone, and it's truly a pleasure to be here. My name is Tamuka Chekero, and I always like to introduce myself as a nimble-footed African. I'm honored to see everyone here, and I appreciate you taking time to join me today. And I appreciate, the Bauseli School of International Affairs in organizing and the organizing team for inviting me to share and to discuss this book with everyone. It is such a privilege, for me to present this book. The book is titled "Resilient Social Networks and Mobility Strategies Among Migrants in Cape Town." It is an absolute, a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak about this monograph. This book is deeply personal to me, but it's also deeply scholarly. It comes from years of thinking, years of moving around, years of observing, and a lot of years of engaging with the everyday lives of migrants in South Africa. I've never formally launched this book since its publication, so I feel honored to have this moment to share it with you for the first time. In many ways, this talk, I would like to have it serve as a personal book launch, and I hope we can engage with some of its important insights. Um, I think mobility is a very important issue, especially now when so much is happening across the globe. Questions of movement, questions of belonging and survival are becoming more urgent, and this book tries to speak directly to those concerns. Indeed, it would be an injustice for me not to take a moment to share how this book came about, because the journey itself is also part of the story. So this book was born out of my PhD thesis at the University of Cape Town in the Department of Anthropology, when I graduated in 2023. However, it was not just an academic exercise. It was a lived process shaped by questions, shaped also by doubts and constant learning and unlearning and relearning. I remember many moments of uncertainty where I had to rethink what I thought I knew about migration in everyday life. Since even during my masters, I had studied, migrants in another part of South Africa, in Limpopo province. So I had almost 5 chapters of my PhD that I wrote, but they did not make it into the final dissertation because I felt that they were not strong enough to be part of the final thesis. However, these chapters also came in very handy in the writing of this book. I was very fortunate to be guided by two incredible supervisors, Professor Franz Nyamjo and Professor Fiona Ross, who really pushed me to think differently about migration. I also have to honor my mentor, Professor Shannon Moreira, for pushing and mentoring me, and also, combined all their efforts have contributed to the birth of my PhD and later on the birth of this book. They did not just supervise the work, they challenged me, they encouraged me, they helped me to see beyond the obvious. Moreover, I often like to ask, how many of us can point to the people who truly changed the way we think? For me, this journey was shaped by that kind of, mentorship. One surprising thing that I also wanted to share today was that I never planned to have PhD. I never wanted to do PhD. I never wanted to go for PhD. My plan was just simple. I just wanted to finish my master's degree, look for a job, then I'm done. That's all I had in mind, at that time. However, things did not go as I planned. Um, you know, my supervisor, my primary supervisor, PhD supervisor, Professor Nyamjo, convinced me. Perhaps I could say I was tricked into doing PhD. I never planned doing PhD, but I think he tricked me somehow into doing it. Looking back, I realized it was one of the most, important decisions I made in this academic journey, though I did not see it that way at the beginning. So in 2018, I was staying in Johannesburg. So I was invited by Professor Nyingjo to come to Cape Town for what he described as an informal discussion about, joining the PhD program. It sounded relaxed and straightforward. I thought maybe it was just going to have brief conversation then is going to give me a platform to decide. However, when I arrived at this office at the University of Cape Town, the experience took me by surprise. It took an unexpected turn. Instead of a typical welcome, he looked at me and said, "Oh, the descendant of Cecil Rhodes, welcome." I was surprised. I was puzzled and I was unsettled. I was so unsure whether to laugh or to question what he meant. For the moment, I was completely, taken aback. I genuinely wondered if he had mistaken me for someone else. I even asked myself, am I white? I looked at myself, definitely I'm not. It felt confusing and slightly uncomfortable at the time. However, as later I came to understand and comprehend, this was not just a casual joke, a random comment. It was a deliberate provocation meant to make me think by invoking Cecil Rhodes, the colonial figure whose grave is in my home country, Zimbabwe, and whose legacy continues to shape Southern Africa. Professor Nyamjo was making a deeper point. His words were an intellectual invitation. They pushed me to reflect more critically on the questions of identity, the questions of history, the questions of belonging, and also to consider how colonial legacies continue to shape mobility and how we see ourselves and others today. It was a way of questioning the enduring, colonial ideas of superiority and exclusion. It was a way of, trying to question the legacy that represents the colonial obsession with superiority, what I would like to call exclusionary completeness, borrowing, of course, from Professor Nyamjo. So this way of thinking, ignores the fact that as human beings, we are deeply interconnected and dependent on one another, which is exactly what this book is all about. So as I mentioned earlier, so this book grew out of my doctoral research. And at the time, I was deeply interested in migration, but I also felt that many studies that were there and the many literature that I was reading was not capturing what migrants actually do in their everyday lives. So much of the literature was focused on the issues of borders, on the issues of policies, on the issues of administrative categories, such as refugees in South Africa, foreigners in South Africa, these immigrants in South Africa, undocumented immigrants in South Africa, often highlighting their nationality. Oh, these Nigerians in South Africa, you Congolese in South Africa, you Zimbabweans in South Africa. While these categories are important, I realize that they often flatten, and ignore the lived experience of people. They do not fully explain, how migrants navigate the daily life, how they survive economic and social challenges, or create meaning in the city. I wanted to look beyond the labels and the numbers and the statistics in order to understand how mobility, how social networks, and how everyday strategies shape migrants' lives. So this perspective allowed me to see migrants not just as passive subjects of policy or statistics, but as active, creative, and resilient agents within the urban space. So I thought probably I should start asking different questions rather than asking questions from the already existing literature. I had to create, a different set of questions. So instead of focusing on who migrants are, trying to define migrants, I asked what do migrants do? How do they move through the city? Who do they rely on for support? How do they navigate daily life and survive in spaces that are often hostile and exclusionary? I wanted to understand, the strategies, the networks, the everyday practices that enable them to keep going, to belong, and that enable them to create opportunity for themselves. It was from these questions and from observing and from listening, from following, from engaging with migrants that this book began to take shape. So at the core of this book, there lies what social scientists refer to as the mobility 10. This perspective urges us to move or to take movement and mobility seriously, not merely as an act of, moving from one place to another, but as a force that influences, life itself. Mobility is not neutral or incidental. It is deeply interconnected to how people live, to how people work, to how people belong, to how they identify themselves, how they identify others, and to how they create opportunities in their everyday, worlds. So in this book, mobility is both an analytical lens and it is also an ethnographic method. By following migrants across neighborhoods, taxis, workplaces, homes, informal markets, places of worship, among many other places in Cape Town, I capture the fluid and the relational nature of their lives. Migrants' existence is not static. It is defined by constant negotiation, constant adaptation, constant movement. They're always moving around. And if they are not moving, goods and services are on the move. So mobility enables access to, essential resources and also the many needs of social networks and the creation of support systems that are critical for survival. So through these movements, migrants build the relationships, they exchange critical information, and also they sustain livelihoods. And this highlights the interconnectedness of space, the interconnectedness of sociality, and the everyday strategies. So tracking mobility reveals how migrants navigate structural constraints, how they respond to uncertainty, and how they enact agency in urban contexts. So in this way, movement is not simply physical, it is deeply social. It shapes the patterns of inclusion, exclusion, solidarity, resilience within the city's dynamic urban fabric. So by foregrounding mobility, this book challenges conventional ways of understanding urban life and migration. It invites us to see the city not as a fixed structure, but as something that is constantly shifting, as a terrain that is constantly shifting, which is almost shaped by the strategies and the resilience of those who move through it. However, movement alone cannot account for the survival of migrants in the city. It is important also to understand that mobility must be considered alongside social relationships that give it meaning and direction. So one of the central arguments of this book is therefore that, you know, uh, migrants sustain themselves and navigate urban life through their networks and relationships. So these connections are not incidental, they are patterned, they are very purposeful, and they are imbued with emotional significance. They are sites of care, they are also sites of trust, mutual obligation, where resources, information, and support flow. So I refer to these intertwined networks of connection as resilient social networks, hence the title of the book. They are very dynamic social formations that not only facilitate survival, but they also provide the scaffolding for belonging. They provide scaffolding for agency, strategic action in urban environment that is often precarious, exclusionary, and that is very unpredictable. So in essence, mobility and social networks, they're inseparable. We cannot separate the two. One gains meaning through the other, and together they reveal how migrants, craft livelihoods and negotiate urban life. Now, one of the first things I do in the book is to challenge the way migrants are usually studied. Um, I've mentioned about the legal categories earlier on, such as refugee, such as foreigner, such as illegal migrant. So these come from the state. They are state categories in which they use to categorize migrants. They are administrative legal labels meant to classify, and most importantly, they are meant to control movement and they're meant to control people. So if you look closely, you see that these categories, they are not just neutral. They shape how migrants are treated. So a documented migrant and an undocumented migrant, a refugee and asylum seeker, they are treated differently. And the way they experience the city is different. So they can hide the real, everyday lives of people on the move. So if we focus on the labels, we don't get to understand the experience of people who are on the move. So it is more interesting to follow how migrants navigate, how they resist and even reshape these labels, creating their own ways of belonging and their own social worlds that the law and the bureaucracy cannot fully capture. So it is important to highlight that in everyday life, migrants do not live by these labels. They live through relationships. So they live through relationships with one another. So interconnectedness, and the debt and indebtedness is very important in this day-to-day survival of migrants. So instead of starting with categories, I start with networks. So some of the important questions I had to ask myself before, venturing into this research, I had to ask myself, who do migrants know? Who support them? Who do they trust? And how do the relationships that they create help them to move, to work, and to belong? So by focusing on networks, I think it is very important because we begin to see something different here. We begin to see the density, we begin to see the intensity, and we also begin to see the range of relationships that migrants rely on. We begin to see that survival is not individual, it is a collective. Now, to make sense of this relationship, I try to draw on decolonial frameworks. This is very personal and this is very important to me because all along, much of the theories and concepts that were used to try and make sense of African migrants was from elsewhere. So rather than relying on those, Western theories, I turn on African ways of knowledge and knowing. And at the center of this framework that I bring is the concept of hushamwari. So hushamwari is a Shona concept from Zimbabwe, which is my home language. It is a framework that speaks of friendship, mutual support, and kin-like bonds or kin-like connections that are very close to kin. Nevertheless, it is more than just friendship. It is about obligation. It is about care. It is about standing with each other in terms of need. So I bring Shamari into conversation with Ubuntu, a concept many of us are very, well versed with. Ubuntu, which emphasizes, shared humanity. I am because we are. I try to combine these two concepts to try and bring a new framework to understand migrants, from an African perspective. Moreover, I also engage deeply with the work of my supervisor, my primary supervisor, Professor Franz Yamjo, whose ideas have also been very influential in shaping this book. So Yamjo invites us to think about concepts such as, incompleteness, conviviality, such as nimble-footedness. I would like to put a pause here and reflect briefly on this because this is very important. Nyamjo reminds us that a human being is not complete. Rather, a human is not complete, and we are all incomplete in our sense in our nature. We are always becoming, and he always emphasized that being and becoming a permanent work in progress. So he tells us that being incomplete requires us to be nimble-footed. So in this situation, life of migrants requires nimble-footedness, and nimble-footedness is the ability to move, the ability to adjust, the ability to adapt, the ability to navigate and negotiate the city, which is very exclusionary, the city that is very hostile towards that they define as not belonging, for those that they define as makwerekwere. So this idea also of nimble-footedness and is also captured in the proverb that is given by the prominent writer, the late Chinua Achebe. He writes that the world is a dancing masquerade. If you want to understand it, you cannot remain standing in one place. It speaks directly to the lives of migrants in Cape Town. They cannot stand still. They must move. And when they are moving, it's not just about moving. They have to know when to move and when not to move. They know when to go out and when not to go out, which, routes to take when you are moving, which mode of transport do you need to take when you are moving. They must adjust, always adjusting and readjusting, knowing when to be a migrant and when not to be a migrant, when to be visible and when to be invisible. Hence, they have to be flexible enough and they have to always find they must constantly find new ways of being and becoming. And this is exactly what this book emphasizes. So I never wanted to give the summary of the chapters of this book But I thought probably, many of the people who are joining probably have not had the chance to read the book. So allow me to just give a summary of the 8 chapters of this book. So in chapter 1, I try by all means to give a broader context. I look at South Africa's history of apartheid, which controlled movement and which created racialized spaces. I think the very same is happening even today. These patterns are very visible and continue to shape mobility in the city. I try by all means to define this context as old wine in new bottles. Indeed, the government and the regime has changed, but we could see that the policies still and the effects of apartheid and colonialism are still lingering. So when migrants enter the city, it is already divided. They must find ways to navigate the space, but also to navigate hostility, to navigate xenophobia, to navigate exclusion. Then also on chapter 2, I reflect on the methodology. I think this was one of the most, interesting for me, one of the most interesting chapters I've ever written, uh, because this chapter challenged me to see that whatever I thought I knew about migration, I had not started. It challenged me in so many ways that I began to appreciate migration studies from a different angle. So it also challenged me to understand that research is not a straight line. Fieldwork is messy, fieldwork is unpredictable, and you have to be flexible. I always give this example. My first day into the field, I went in the city of Cape Town in the evening. I went to a certain restaurant where I met some Congolese bouncers. I tried to speak to them, and my assumption was that we are all migrants. And under that assumption of all being migrants, I thought we could easily connect. But they refused to speak to me in English because they were more comfortable speaking in French, which I also did not understand. So I had glossed over these differences between us, thinking that the label that we shared, the label of migrant, could make us, even closer. So that reminded me that being a migrant, is not just a category. It is, it is lived differently by everyone. In many ways, doing research with migrants requires the same nimble-footedness that migrants use when they are living their lives. You have to adapt, you have to negotiate, renegotiate, and respond to the social dynamics around you. Trust is not automatic, even though you are all migrants, you trust is automatic, is not automatic. So I think my reflexivity was challenged. I had to challenge my own positionality. So access also is not given. You need to earn it. Understanding, comes from paying attention to the subtleties of relationships and also the way people navigate inclusion and exclusion. So this chapter, that's why I had to put it in, earlier on from chapter 1, then chapter 2, because it shaped the way in which all the chapters that followed, were written and were analyzed. In chapter 3, I focused on convivial spaces. These are the spaces in which, relationships are not only navigated, but this is where relationships are cultivated. So I focused on soccer fields where people play social soccer. I focused on, places of worship. I focused on restaurants because everybody would like to eat. So I was trying to understand how in these spaces, people form relationships that transcends, nationality. You would understand and you would see that people from different nationalities can create connections when they are playing soccer and all that. Then in chapter 4, I focus on the urban frontier. This is where things became more difficult because in this one, I was focusing on the everyday challenges that migrants had to endure, migrants had to negotiate and navigate. For example, police raids, when they are being raided at night, the harassment that they face every day, and sometimes the violence from community groups such as Operation Dudula. I think those who are following right now currently what's happening in South Africa can have an appreciation of what Operation Dudula is doing. So I had to understand how they navigate all these challenges. And what came about was what I would like to call strategic invisibility. Migrants, they knew very well when to be visible and when to disappear. And, relationships also, even with the law enforcement here, the relationships also were very important. Then I moved on to chapter 5 and 6. And then these two chapters, they are very important because they speak to the issues of gender and also the issues of crisis. So in chapter 5, I focus on women. I deliberately, try to focus on women. The reason is that the level of vulnerability that they have as migrant women and as compared to their male counterparts was different. So migrant women, they face specific challenges such as violence, harassment, economic vulnerability. Because, for example, if much of the work people can get easily without documents is in construction, people can easily get those job opportunities. But it is very difficult for women to go in those spaces, and then it becomes very difficult for them. So they've got a specific kind of challenge that they face. But however, it does not necessarily mean that they are passive. Women who work as vendors, some work as hairdressers, some as domestic workers, some as Uber drivers. They rely on, friendship networks, the one that I coined hushamwari networks, to support each other. They share information, they protect each other, they create safe spaces in the unsafe environments. One of the most interesting thing was how you would find that there were female Uber drivers who are migrants. They were, I think Uber driving is a very, very, very dangerous, kind of work that you would want to engage in South Africa. And you would hear of stories of people being, hijacked every day and everything happening around the Uber area. So we having women, being in Uber, doing Uber driving was one of the most resilient and very important issues that I had to write about. So I also, moved on chapter 6, which was talking about crisis. I had to take a step back to look at COVID-19, even though I did my write-up in 2022. I had to focus on what happened in 2020 and 2021 during the COVID pandemic, when there was total lockdown across South Africa and also across the world, if I could say that. So this was a moment of crisis, and the movement was restricted. So I genuinely wanted to understand if movement, physical movement of human beings was restricted, how were migrants surviving? And what was disrupted of their everyday life? So how migrants did not stop moving. Instead, they did not stop moving at all. They created new ways of movement. Instead, they found new ways to move. you know, um, they were moving livelihood objects, such as food, such as goods, such as money. And how did they move these livelihood objects? They used social networks to circulate these resources. So even in crisis, mobility did not disappear. It changed from, I remember one of the participants I was speaking to, who started his, remittance business. He created a remittance business, and which is still thriving up to now, which is booming up to now, but it started out of that situation. So crisis paved way for opportunity. So instead of seeing crisis, I think migrants saw an opportunity for themselves to continue making money, for them to continue, upping their livelihood strategies. Then I went to I went on to chapter 7. So my chapter 7, I took a more critical approach. So in this chapter, I try to show that social networks are not always perfect. Indeed, my book is much more focused on social networks, how people identify themselves through social networks, how migrants identify themselves through conviviality, how they identify themselves through hushamwari, ubuntu, nimble-footedness, among other things. But conviviality and hushamwari does not mean that tension is over. That does not erase friction. Rather, it is a tool that allows us to understand that friction can happen, but still people can communicate across ostensible difference. This chapter served to pose a question, but also serves to remind us that relationships can be fragile and they can be strained. So in this chapter, I try to look at the conflicts that arose, and much of the conflicts that I saw among migrants, it was over, number one, over religion. That if a person who is a Muslim is living with a person who is a Christian or an unbeliever, you would understand that there was always friction. And I documented a lot of those, stories in vignettes that I document in the book about those frictions that were happening. Also friction over space. It could happen that, when people are sharing the same space, friction is bound to happen. Conflicts are bound to arise, over space and also over resources. So this chapter critically look at relationships, not trying to over romanticize relationships, but to try to look at, how fragile they are, but also as a necessary toolkit, as a powerful tool, that is used to solve these tensions. So, however, we need to understand that hushamwaris and conviviality, they're not always romantic. They are real, yes, but they are not romantic. But it's a powerful tool to remind us how people resolve tensions and also how they resolve friction. Then I moved on to my chapter 8. On chapter 8, I think I returned to the idea of resilience. This was my conclusion. I was trying to conclude the book, but I did not want to just reiterate or regurgitate all the discussions that I had from chapter 1 up to chapter 7. I tried to understand what is it exactly that I wanted to show with this book. So what I wanted to show was the resilience of these social networks. Hence, resilient social networks became the title of the book. So I try to show that social networks are not just coping mechanisms, but they are also forms of resistance. They allow migrants to push back against exclusion. They also allow migrants to claim the space in the city, and they allow them to live life beyond home borders. So this is the conclusion of the book. Now let me just speak briefly about what this book contributes, because a lot of people would ask me, what is it that your book contributes to contemporary debates? As many people have been asking. So first of all, it contributes to the mobility 10, which I've mentioned earlier on, by showing that movement is not only about crossing borders. It is the everyday movement within the city that is very important, because much of the literature I was reading was focusing on how people move from their home countries into South Africa, how people move from one province to another, or how people move from urban areas to rural areas, or from rural areas to urban areas. But not much has been done on how people move within the city itself and how people employ mobility and social networks in order for them to survive within the city. So my book contributes by bringing that aspect in that perspective of understanding how mobility is a lived reality within the city. How do people navigate the city within the city? The everyday movement within the city is what I try to focus on, rather than focusing on movement across borders. And then secondly, I think it also challenges the dominant narrative that portrays, migrants as victims. Much of the literature has been focusing on the challenges that migrants face. I'm not trying to limit and diminish the challenges that migrants face. However, I'm trying to give them platform to show that they are also very creative, they are very innovative, and they are very agentive, rather than being framed as passive victims of violence in South Africa. Because violence is happening, but still they find ways to navigate that violence. So it was very important for me to document that, migrants, they always find ways to negotiate and navigate the violence that they face, the exclusion and the hostility that they face in their everyday lives. Then third, I think the book also it introduces, the African concepts such as hushamwari into migration studies. Hushamwari is a concept that was touched upon by earlier scholars like Tamuka, but they had not brought it directly into migration studies. So this is very important to me. And too often, the African experiences are explained using theories from elsewhere. So I try by all means to show that African concepts, they can also produce theory, they can produce frameworks for us to understand the world in new ways. And then at policy level, I think the book is very important. It has got very important policy implications. It shows that enforcement, heavy approaches, the raids that happen in South Africa, the harassment, the strict visa regime. I think a lot of people can testify right now that getting even a student visa in South Africa is becoming very difficult. So all these strict visa regimes, they do not solve problems. So instead, they increase vulnerability. And also, I think all of these combined, they increase illegality that they seek and purport to control. So if we want cohesion, we must recognize that migrants are part of the city. They are part of the life. They are not threats, but rather they are contributors. They contribute to what is obtaining in South Africa. So to conclude my talk about this book is about movement. This book is about movement, and more importantly, it is about people in movement. It is about how they survive. It is about how they connect. It is also about how they become. It is about how, even in difficult conditions, people try to find new ways to live. They always try to find new ways to relate. And also, they always try to find new ways to hope. And moreover, in the spirit of my dear supervisor, Professor Nyamjo, it reminds us to understand that life is always in motion. Life is always in constant motion. We are all in different ways nimble-footed. We are all in different ways incomplete, and we are all becoming. And most importantly, we are all outsiders. We are all makwere. Thank you very much.